Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the kind invitation to share my thoughts on the topic of this seminar. I think the presentation is well placed in the series of things I've heard so far, because it pulls together the most important lessons that we've just put on the table. My argument is very simple but profound. The transition to sustainable food systems that we need so badly is only as effective as the policies that we craft, and that includes the policy implementation. And that's that argument I want to substantiate with a few examples, but also by looking into Europe and what the European Union has done recently in that realm. But let's take a step back and ask why are we talking of food system transformations, or the transitions towards more sustainable food systems that stay within the planetary boundary? Well, here you have a few reasons, a few arguments. First, the inequity in the food system. Previous speakers have spoken about those, at least indirectly, but also we are witnessing a rapid nutrition transition that's linked to the transition from low to middle income countries, and that takes place in rural areas, but particularly in urban areas, in towns and cities. Then we have the whole domain of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture emits, but is also carrying the burden, particularly in low-income countries. Unsustainable agricultural production that accelerates the degradation of ecosystem and crucial ecosystem services. And fourth, it seems that we are narrowing down the spectrum of the things we produce and eat. A loss of biodiversity is a big issue. And yet the policy responses that we put on the table, and we've heard a few already, appear to be fragmented, often disconnected, sometimes incoherent to each other. And yet we need a systemic solution. A food system transformation isn't simple. It requires not only agriculture to change, but all the back and forward linkages, including the consumption side. And policies shape that arena in which we enable and support this transition, respectively transformation. Hence, the policies are critical, and the transition is only as effective as the policies, including the implementation. And let's look at to me, a very striking set of data. Without going into the metric tons, you see two curves on the top. You see maize and wheat over a period of 60 years with some projections into the future. And you see that wheat, but in particular maize at global level, goes up. And then at the bottom, you see selected grain legumes and dryland cereals that ICRISAT further develops. And you see hardly any changes. Of course, there's an issue of scale in that figure, but I think what you see here clearly illustrates a gap. Now, why is that? Well, many reasons. One reason is policy and the inability to steer the curves into a more meaningful direction. And there's plenty of evidence on why this is happening. Just a few weeks ago, my colleague Alistair Orr and a couple of other ICRISAT colleagues published that global food security paper on that big question: why do small grains, and here sorghum and millet, don't scale? Yeah, why are we still talking about their importance? And why do farmers opt for other commodities, particularly in areas where from a drought resilient point of view, it would be good to run through with small grains? Same for the consumers. Well, often seeds are unavailable. We've heard that. Consumer prices prohibit the purchase of of millets. If you have to pay 10 to 20% more, but depend on a US dollar a day for your diet, then you think twice whether you go into small grain or bounce back to maize. Extension services, the amount we invest in agricultural research, all that creates that enabling or disabling environment for small grains to either fly or just stall. And despite some decent progress, also in relation or in response to the grain legumes and dryland cereals program, there's quite some way to go. And the policies, as of now, seem to be linked to almost a Greek mythology where Sisyphus tries to move up a stone, up a slope, and the stone keeps bouncing back. As many of my colleagues try to promote cereals, small grains, and keep receiving these bounce backs. Well, one reason for that is certainly the normative direction of many policies currently at place at national and regional level, and also the measures previous speakers spoke about, getting the metrics right. Secondly, the food system governance, the way we incentivize maize vis-a-vis millet. I think it's very clear to the audience that the curve would further go up for maize and not for the small grains. But then there are common policy challenges that are not specific to agriculture, but specifically prevalent in agriculture. One is the vision policy gap, where there isn't an expressive statement about the promotion of dryland cereals, for instance, across the policies. But there's also the issue of policy coherence, we spoke about that, and finally a policy practice gap. Food safety and the whole space of aflatoxins in the food chain, my colleague Professor Boger spoke about that, is such an example. So we must see the political economy about the alternatives we talk about and unpack that in order to understand why we are not moving. An example I would like to share with you in brief or comes from the European Union. And just this year, the European Union put on the table the Farm to Fork strategy for fair, healthy, and environment-friendly food systems. A bold strategy, which is the basis for a whole policy agenda. And three things that stand out. First is comprehensiveness and the coordination of interventions and respective policies across the entire food chain. And that includes food loss and waste, as well as safety. It's not only about production, it is equally about consumption and processing. Secondly, an action orientation and transition finance to convert the various aspects of the food system into a more sustainable state of affairs. And certainly partnership beyond the European Union, as we all know that one country and one region can't move on its own. It requires an alliance, it requires partnership, because the food systems are linked through trade, and that demands a greater multilateral coherence. Now, what can we learn for the small grains, assuming that they play an important role in transitioning food systems in the drylands? Well, 5 points that stand out in my opinion. First, we need an alternative narrative, and the policies do play a role because they set the tone, they set the language for or against small grains, and visionary targets and the right attitude across the main actors in the value chain. Secondly, new additional marketing strategies, including certification and labeling, fairness in the value chain, getting the subsidies right, getting true cost accounting into the equations, but also consumer lobbying and protection groups. Fourth, I think that's something we can learn from the European Union, targeted transition finance. And that would mean supporting flower blending initiatives, for instance, to get the private sector into that space. And finally, renegotiate social contracts between governments and society. If you want to bend the curve of maize to the advantage of small grains, we need a new contract between governments and consumers. Particularly in Eastern and Southern Africa, maize is linked to stability, political stability. This can be replaced, this can be substituted, this can be progressed through a new advanced social contract between governments and society. Conclusion. As I said at the beginning, food system transitions are as good and they move as fast as the policies and the implementation of policies based on a bold strategy and a vision. But effective policy support also requires a way more systemic, inclusive, and co-created policy process and co-created policy designs. And these policy designs must be based on a candid conversation about the political economy that prohibits progress in some areas and almost freezes the current state of affairs in things we actually want to change. This is it. Thank you very much. Back to you, Mrs. Chair.
That's very insightful. You have given us your perspective on the small grains, but also brought in some examples, I think, from Europe in terms of how they have been able to take some bold decisions on building a strategy that is comprehensive, a strategy that is action-oriented, and there is partnership and with clear targeting. I definitely believe that that's something that we need for the transitioning foods. So in your opinion, we have discussed from the previous panel, but also the panelists in this session, they have also said there's a clear disconnect between food and nutrition. We have all these strategies. Do you think that we go back to the drawing board and start re-strategizing agriculture and nutrition in order for these small grains to find their place? Where should we start from? Should we just patch where we are, or we start re-strategizing and borrow some of the good examples you have highlighted? Over to you, Michael.
Well, thanks for the question, which is too big to answer comprehensively, I believe, because it's the answers are context specific. But what I can say is that many good policies are in place already. I mentioned aflatoxin, and in Kenya, I would cite that as a good example. But what Kenya shows very well is that consumer awareness and the ability of citizens to express their demands with regard to food and nutrition in terms of quantity and quality are critical. So I believe it's both a governance issue that we have at hand, as well as a bottom-up consumer-driven process. So strengthening policies to strengthen consumer protection groups will be critical, especially during that nutrition transition that we currently observe as countries move from low to middle income countries. Back to you.
There's a question for you in the chat box. Can you expand on the alternative narrative? What narrative should be not continue with, and what should be part of the new narrative?
Well, we're already progressing that narrative collectively, the new narrative, by expanding food security into the nutrition space. So it's not just carbohydrates, but it's also macro and micronutrients and vitamins, which are essential for nutrition. Our research shows very well how closely linked food narratives and consumption habits are. People eat the way they speak about food, and vice versa. And that is not only a local issue. That goes up to politics at the end. So the way we speak about maize and food security vis-a-vis small grains for nutrition is something we have to get right. In our interviews with low-income populations, we constantly hear that well, millet, if we eat millet, we belong to the poorer segment of society, because it's a poor woman's or poor man's crop. And that's a kind of narrative that kind of is linked to the behavioral intention and the actual behavior at the end. And that has to be changed. And that's not something we can do just locally. That's something that requires campaigns, that requires awareness, that requires people and examples, as we've heard in this panel, people who in high positions who speak up and say, well, we want to diversify our food plate, because the diversity we consume is also the diversity we need on farms in order to transition well. Mrs. Chair?
Very much.